Hi Rockridge, this is Mrs. Berger, and today I actually have 3 guest stars with me. I have my 3 boys from the Berger family to help me explain adding and subtracting rational expressions. So last class we did multiplying and dividing these fractions. Today we're going to add and subtract them. So let's think back to our early days of fractions and remember that the key to adding and subtracting rational expressions is
a lowest common denominator, or LCD. We're doing this in 5th grade.
That's right. Thank you, Callan. An LCD, or lowest common denominator, is crucial to adding and subtracting any kind of fraction. And like Callan just said, he's doing this in 5th grade. So let's recall back to 5th grade how we did these. If we look at 2/3 and 1/2, we need to think, what is the lowest common denominator? What's the lowest number that both of these numbers multiply to? And hopefully you immediately thought, oh, I know, it's 6. So in order to get each of these denominators to 6, we need to do something different to each one. To this fraction, we need to multiply by 3/3. To this fraction, we need to multiply by 2/2. Once you do that, you have them both at a common denominator. The left-hand fraction turns into 4/6. The right-hand fraction turns into 3/6. And so you then have a total of 7/6. That is the sum of those two fractions. So we've added those two fractions. Refresher again, let's look at this one. We think, what could possibly be the lowest common denominator that we could reach to? Again, we need to multiply these numbers by 1, 2, 3, 4 until we find the lowest one that they all get to. So 8 could be multiplied by 1 or 2 to get 16. 3 would be 24. 4 multiplied by 1, it's 4. 2, it's 8. 3, it's 12. 16, 20, 24. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24. So we didn't get a common number until we got all of them to 24. So 24 is the lowest common denominator for these guys. So let's get everybody there. In order to get this first fraction there, we would multiply by 3/3. To get the second fraction there, we would multiply by 6/6. And to get the last fraction there, we would multiply by 8/8. You don't have to jot this down if you can already see it, but just to remind yourself how you got there. So this first fraction becomes 21/24 minus 18/24 plus 8/24. Now that you have that common denominator, you can combine those numerators. So 21 minus 18 plus 8 is 11. Now, we can mix in variables. We can determine the lowest common denominator even if we have letters and numbers. Clearly the x is common to both. Now let's look at the 6 and the 8. What is the lowest common number that we can get for 6 and 8? Once again, we're faced with a 24. So the lowest common denominator, letters and numbers, variables and numbers, for these is 24x. To get this fraction there, it's already got the x, so all you would need to multiply by is 3/3. To get this fraction there, you would need to multiply by 4/4. Again, it's already got the x. So this turns into 28/24x plus 15/24x. Now that you have that common denominator, the sum of those fractions, on the top we can just add that 28 and 15 to get 43. So that's a little refresher on how to add and subtract fractions. Now, as we launch into more advanced topics here today, let's remind ourselves, deciding on a lowest common denominator for this is similar. We just have to remember, list all the multiples of each of the denominators, choose the smallest multiple that appears in all the lists. Sometimes that smallest multiple is found by literally just multiplying the denominators together if they don't have anything else in common. Don't forget, you need to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by that same factor. So whatever you came up with that denominator was missing, you have to multiply the top and the bottom by that. Okay? All right, so let's launch into our examples here. Take a look at number 4 here. We've got a fraction minus another fraction. Let's look at the denominator first and find out what the lowest common denominator is. Now, treat each of these factors as one single entity. So we're not treating that x as a common denominator. We have to look at this entire factor here of x minus 3 as one of the denominators. So there actually isn't anything common on both of these. So the lowest common denominator is those two denominators multiplied by one another. All right? So now we need to look at each fraction and see who's missing what. The first fraction already has an x minus 3 in the denominator, and it's missing an x plus 2. So in order to get it there, we're going to take this original fraction and multiply it by what it's missing, x plus 2 over x plus 2. The second fraction already has an x plus 2 in the denominator, so it's only missing the x minus 3. So let's give it what it's missing, the x minus 3. Now that you have this common denominator for both of them, you can combine the fraction into one. So now you have your common denominator of x minus 3, x plus 2. Now let's look and see what we have at the top. Let's go ahead and distribute this 3, so 3x plus 6, and subtract this out, minus 5x plus 15 is our combined numerator. There's nothing left to do on this denominator, you're just dragging it along for the rest of the problem. So x minus 3, x plus 2 comes along for the ride for the rest of the problem. Now let's combine like terms at the top. So I'm going to combine these x's, so I have a total of negative 2 x's, and I have a plus 21 for the constant. That is the difference of those two fractions. You have subtracted those two fractions. All right, let's take a look at number 5. Number 5's lowest common denominator. I see a common x, so that's definitely something there. And then I see a 3 and a 6. So I can get this 3 up to 6 by multiplying it by 2. So my common denominator, my lowest common denominator for this one is 6x. So again, let's see who's missing what. 2 over 3x. In order to get to the common denominator, I'm going to need to multiply by 2 over 2. The minus 5 over 6x already has the common denominator, so there's nothing to do there. So now that I have both of these multiplied out, I can go ahead and combine them over one single common denominator and figure out what I've got. I've got 2 times 2, which is 4, minus 5. So my final is negative 1 over 6x. If any of this is going too fast for you, pause the video and go back and see how I came up with any of these steps. Lowest common denominator is definitely the most crucial part of these problems. All right, let's do number 6 and look at this denominator and this denominator. What is the lowest common denominator for this set? Well, there's really nothing common to either of these, so I'm going to have to multiply them by one another to see my lowest common denominator. So on the left, my left-hand fraction, what's it missing? It's missing the x minus 2. So let's give it the x minus 2. My right-hand fraction is missing the x plus 2. So let's give it the x plus 2. Now that they're over a common denominator, I can start combining them. Distribute the 3, 3x minus 6. Distribute the negative 8, negative 8x minus 16. And then combine your numerator terms. Drag the denominator along for the ride. Combine like terms on the top. Combine your constants. And that is your final fraction. That's your combined fraction, this fraction minus that fraction. Sometimes when we're doing these operations, we need to
Factor the denominators. I'm doing this in Algebra 1.
Thank you, Owen. That's our second guest star for today. That's right. We need to factor the denominators before figuring out what that LCD is. Okay, so you're going to be bringing those factoring skills once again to the forefront to take care of these. So take a look at number 7. Number 7 is not obviously, you can't obviously see what a common denominator might be for that one. So in order to figure out what that common denominator is going to be for both of those, we need to see all the different components that those can be broken into. So that's what we mean by that. So sometimes we cannot add or subtract these fractions until we factor that denominator. Let's do that now. So x plus 1, that doesn't really need to be factored. But the bottom, what multiplies to 4 and adds to 4, I'm sure Owen already knows this by heart, but that's right, it's x plus 2 times x plus 2. So that's the denominator there. We've just rewritten it. We haven't done anything to it yet. We've just rewritten this denominator in factored form. Now let's look at the second one here. There's nothing to do to the 2, but this x squared minus 4, does everybody remember what that is? That's a difference of squares, and so we need to be breaking that down into x plus 2 and x minus 2. Okay, so we have now factored the denominator like Owen told us we needed to. Now we can see what is that common denominator that we're going to be using. So this denominator has an x plus 2 and an x plus 2. This denominator has an x plus 2 and an x minus 2. So hopefully you can see that the lowest common denominator is going to be x plus 2, x plus 2, and x minus 2. Those are all the things that would make this a common denominator. This fraction has 2 of the x plus 2's, but it's missing the x minus 2. This fraction has 1 of the x plus 2's and the x minus 2, so it's just missing the x plus 2. Okay, so hopefully that was pretty easy to see. So let's get these guys up to speed here. Let's get this guy his missing x plus 2. And let's get this guy his missing x minus 2. So now we have the common denominator. As ugly as it is, we have this common denominator, and all we have left to do is figure out a clean version of our numerator. So to do that, we're going to need to FOIL this together. So x squared plus x minus 2x minus 2. And we're going to need to distribute this negative 2. So negative 2x minus 4. So that's what our new numerator is. Drag your denominator along for the ride. And if you would like, you can certainly shorten this a little bit by saying x plus 2 squared. That's fine. And then x minus 2. It means the same thing, but drag that denominator along for the ride, and then combine your like terms up here. So x squared minus 4x, oh, did I not? I think it's negative 3x. Yes, I didn't count them right. Let's count those correctly here. Minus 3x's, negative 2, and 1, and then minus 6. So that's our nice simplified numerator. So that is this fraction minus this fraction. See how we had to factor that denominator before we could determine what that LCD was going to be. Let's do this a few more times. Question number 8. Once again, we're going to need to factor this, each of these denominators to figure out how we could possibly come up with an LCD. So the first one has a greatest common factor. Hopefully you see that it's got an x that can be taken out. When you take it from here, you leave an x behind. When you take it from here, you leave a plus 6 behind. The second fraction, that's a 3-termer, so we're going to foci that, or figure out what multiplies to negative 18 and adds to positive 3. Think about that for a minute. Hopefully you came up with x plus 6 and x minus 3. So now we can look at this and stare at this and say, oh, okay, I see what the lowest common denominator needs to be. Clearly we have an x plus 6 that's common. This guy is adding an x to the mix, and this guy is adding an x minus 3 to the mix. Let's find out who's missing what. For the common denominator, this one is missing an x minus 3 over x minus 3. This guy is only missing the x part. So once you do that multiplying, you will get your desired lowest common denominator for both of them. Now let's see what the results are. 1 times x minus 3, that's just x minus 3. Minus 12 times x, so that's just minus 12x. One more step of simplification. Drag that denominator along for the ride. There's nothing more for it to do. And then combine like terms here. So you should have negative 11x minus 3. So that is this fraction minus this fraction. Again, if any of that went too fast for you, please do pause the video, stare at the work here for a little while, make sure that you understand how I came up with this lowest common denominator and how I used it to figure out who was missing what. Okay? Let's look at the next problem. Unfortunately, I accidentally numbered this one 8 as well, so this is actually question number 9. Now, let's go ahead and look at each of these and make sure that we have everything factored before we determine the lowest common denominator. Nothing really to do up here. We're just going to bring this x squared plus x minus 3 along for the ride. We're only concerned about lowest common denominator right now. Let's see if we can factor this. What multiplies to positive 32 and adds to negative 12? What two numbers multiply to positive 32 and add to negative 12? Hopefully you thought x minus 4 and x minus 8. Now let's investigate this other fraction. Nothing to see here, and nothing really to do here. X minus 8 doesn't have to be factored. So now I will investigate these two denominators and find what's common. There's definitely an x minus 8 common. And this fraction is adding an x minus 4 to the mix. So that will be our lowest common denominator. Now clearly, this has all the denominator it needs. This is missing the x minus 4 portion. So now that we do have this combined with the purple, we may now put everybody over that common denominator and start combining things. So x squared plus x minus 3 comes along for the ride, plus 3x times this. So we'll distribute the 3x into here. So let's go ahead and do that now. So that would be 3x squared minus 12x. Last little step, drag that denominator along for the ride and combine some like terms. So I've got 1x squared here, 3 of them there, so let's make that 4x squared. I got 1x and negative 12x, so that's a total of negative 11x's, and negative 3 is my constant. So that is the combination. That's this fraction plus this fraction over top of this common denominator. So there is that one. Once again, please do pause the video if you need to stare at the work for a little while. All right, we have 2 more practice problems for you today. Let's take a look at the next one. If you'd like to renumber it as 10, I'm fine with that. Once again, we need to make sure that all the denominators are factored so that we can get a nice clear look at what we're dealing with. Now, I look at this fraction, can't factor that, can't factor this. This guy I'm looking at and I'm saying, wait, there's a greatest common factor here that I can pull out. So let me do that. And I'm going to save myself some paper here and just do it right underneath since I don't have anything else to do to the other guys. So I'm going to pull a 3 out and leave an x squared minus 1 behind. So that's my new denominator for this first fraction. Okay. And then I'm going to stare at it again. I'm going to see that I have a difference of squares, so I can further factor this, and I should. I'm going to further factor this. I'm going to split this, since it's a squared minus b squared. I'm going to further factor that into x plus 1 and x minus 1. So that's the new denominator. So now I've got 10x over this new denominator. Now I'm going to investigate what's common, what's the lowest common denominator for all of these. Well, clearly I have an x minus 1 that's common to everybody. This guy's bringing an x plus 1 into the mix, so I got to make sure I take care of that. This is bringing an x into the mix, so I need to take care of that. And then I've got this 3 and this 6, which I can get to a lowest common denominator of 6. So this monstrosity, 6x times x minus 1 times x plus 1, that's my lowest common denominator, believe it or not. So now I need to figure out who's missing what. And I'm going to switch colors because this is getting confusing. So who's missing what? This first fraction, let me write him as, his original was 10x, and he's got the 3, the x plus 1, and the x minus 1. He is missing, what's he missing? He's missing 2x. So get him his missing 2x. The next fraction, 4 over x minus 1, is missing a whole heck of a lot. So let's see what he's missing. You're missing the 6x, and you're missing the x plus 1. So that is what you'll need, both bottom and top. The next fraction is also missing a whole heck of a lot. So let's bring in what he's missing. He is missing an x minus 1 and an, x minus 1 and x plus 1. But this 6x is already present. So all he needs is x minus 1 and x plus 1. That's all. So now, let's bring all this stuff together over our common denominator. And you're going to be dragging this common denominator along for the ride for the rest of the problem. All right, 10x times 2x, that's 20x squared. 4 times 6x times x plus 1. I'm going to go ahead and make this 4 times 6x a 24x. 24x distributed into here. So that's 24x squared plus 20, oops, sorry about that. Missed a number here. 24x squared plus 24x. So that's that one. And then I know that this purple stuff comes down to x squared. This, when I FOIL this out, it's x squared minus 1. So I'm going to distribute this 5 into there. If you need to do this in more than one step, that's fine. But I'm going to distribute that 5 into there and say 5x squared minus 5. So that's my numerator. Let's make that numerator a little simpler by combining like terms. I'm going to drag my denominator along for the ride. There's nothing I can do there. But let's combine these like terms. So how many total x squareds do I have? I've got 20 plus 24 of them plus 5 of them. So I have a total of 49 of them. And it looks like I only have 24 x's. And I've only got this negative 5 constant. So that's all I've got there. That's all, as if it wasn't enough. So that, my friends, that's the final for this guy. So that is those 3 fractions brought together by the power of lowest common denominator. All right, we have one more uber boss question, boss level question, let's renumber him, number 11. Again, we need to factor these denominators. Just like Owen said, we got to factor these denominators so we can take a look at what's in common and what's not in common. So, first guy, he's a difference of squares. So let's turn that into x plus 5 and x minus 5. Second one, looks like I've got a GCF here. So let's take a look at what that is. My GCF appears to be an 8x, I believe. So let's pull that 8x and leave an x minus 5 behind. And then the top can't have anything done to it. The bottom appears to have a 2x, and I will leave behind an x plus 5. Now, please note, make things easier on yourself. If any of these fractions can be simplified right off the bat, I would do that. Why have a lowest common denominator that's bigger than you need it to be? This x and this x cancel. This 4 and this 8 turn into a 1 and a 2. This x and this x cancel and just leaves an x to the 1 power behind. So now that you have this remaining, let's determine what our lowest common denominator is. It appears that we've got a 2 as a lowest common denominator portion, x plus 5, x minus 5. And let me review here and see if anybody, let's see, I've got this. I've got the 2, I've got the x minus 5, I've got the 2, I've got the x plus 5. So this is my lowest common denominator. Now I need to figure out who is missing what. This one clearly is only missing a 2 over 2. So that's pretty straightforward. This one has a 2 and an x minus 5. It's only missing an x plus 5. This one has a 2 and has an x plus 5 and is only missing an x minus 5. So once we conduct these operations up top, we will have what we need. We'll go ahead and drag our lowest common denominator along for the ride and figure out what these numerators mean. 2 times 3, that's easy, that's 6, plus, now this is a 1, because all this stuff canceled, so 1 times x plus 5, so we can just do plus x plus 5, minus 5x times x minus 5. So minus 5x times x, minus 5x squared, minus 5x times negative 5, that's plus 25x. If you needed to do this in a couple more steps to keep your work straight, that's completely fine. If you need to pause the video to see how those cancellations worked out, that's certainly fine as well. Drag this common denominator along for the ride and simplify this top here. We've got a negative 5x squared. We've got 1x and 25x's, so that's plus 26x's. And we've got a 6 and a 5, that's plus 11. So that is your final answer to question number 11. So we've gone through quite a few different iterations of these problems. Hopefully that gave you a nice foundation.
Alright, so now, do your independent practice, check yourself against the key, and come to class ready with questions.
Thank you, Brandon.